Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I just want to take a moment to say thank you to each and every one of you who listens to my videos and who makes my life possible. Because listening to me really makes a difference to my life and means I can continue making the content you enjoy. So thank you. It's also lovely to read your comments and be able to interact with you on a daily basis. You guys are wonderful. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the author of one of the stories today, whose Instagram is in the description, A Right Struggle. He produces some pretty cool content, and if you'd like to read more on his Instagram, some really short little horror niblets, and perhaps some of his published works, you can find the link in the description. Thanks guys, but for now, it's time to get comfortable. Prepare yourself for the ghosts, and let the darkness take control. I met my wife when I was 26. I suppose it can be considered ironic, really, that it was a funeral which brought us together, especially considering the events I would experience upon moving in with her. I was never really a believer of the paranormal. I guess if we have to apply labels to ourselves, mine would be of a skeptic. Of course, like most people, I had watched various videos on the internet, read stories of hauntings, and occasionally indulged in the odd horror film or two. But my interests were only ever viewed from an outside perspective, and could only really be considered academic at most. Without a frame of reference, I found it hard to believe in these stories, and view them as anything but stories. That would soon change, however, as we quickly fell in love, and I moved in with her shortly after. She had told me about the house before I moved in. She had been living there for 10 years before she had even met me, and by that time there was a lot to tell. Her friends had all experienced something there. They each had their own tale of the unknown. One of her oldest friends had an experience while staying over for the night. Witnessed what can only be described as the outline of a woman move slowly through the room before dissipating abruptly into the darkness. He never slept alone in the house again. My soon-to-be stepchildren would often, when young, point to an empty space in the corner of a room and innocently ask, "Who is that lady?" A horrifying experience, of course, but discountable on its own. If it were not for the other children who would always say the same thing. Every single time they visited our home, it would always be the same question, and it would always be the same corner of the room. Things would only get worse. I remember how my wife recalls the odd smells which would materialize as if from nowhere. The unexplainable noises which would break the peace of the night, and foreboding feeling of not feeling quite alone when you knew you were the only person in the house. It did not take her long to reach out to a paranormal investigation team. They attended our home with Kieran O'Caffey, a paranormal investigator who enjoyed a brief stint of fame after being featured on Most Haunted, a television show which ran here in the United Kingdom. They brought along a psychic who, not long after entering the home, had an unnatural aversion to one particular corner of the room which would soon become my new bedroom, and the particular corner where the children had witnessed the lady. Without any prompt, the psychic explained to my wife that the previous occupant of our house, a woman, had ended her life via rope in that very corner. She finished her reading of the house by sketching a picture of the apparition, a drawing my wife still keeps to this very day. Suffice to say, all of this did little to alleviate my wife's concerns. And this is where I come in. Poor naive me, brazen and full of all the misplaced logic that only a skeptic would apply to a situation which so clearly required it. Well, I even decided that our bed would go in that corner of the room. Looking back now, I can only lament at my childish bravado. My first night was unremarkable, of course. There was the typical excitement about me moving in, but nothing which could be considered otherworldly. At that point in my life, I knew I wanted to be a writer, but lacked any real motivation. That did not stop me, however, from tapping away at my laptop until the early hours of the morning, while my wife slept soundly in the corner. Around 1 in the morning was when it started. It began slightly at first, but it quickly became more noticeable as the minutes progressed. A sound, a noise of sorts. It sounded like scratching, and it was coming from the direction of our bed. I paused my work for a second and turned quickly around in the darkness, my ears directing me towards the source of the noise. My wife was still sleeping in the corner, her face concealed by the shadows. She lays stationary, blissfully unaware of the unnatural sound which had itched its way from the wall near her head. Now, however, I gazed into the blackness of the room. The noise could no longer be heard, almost as if it were never there. A fleeting shimmer of imagination jolted into existence by my wary, fatigued mind. The room all of a sudden felt tight and confining. The walls, although stationary, appeared to have moved an inch while I was busy, closing themselves while restricting my movement. It was an odd sensation, one which burrowed deep, one which felt as if it would be with me for quite some time to come. Chalking the whole feeling up to exhaustion, I closed my laptop and quietly climbed into bed next to my wife. Predictably, sleep came soon. "What are you doing?" I inhaled deeply, my body swaying somewhat as my consciousness returned to me. "Baby, what are you doing down here?" It took a second for my mind to return to me, but when it did, I found myself awakening abruptly, standing on my feet in the middle of our pitch-black kitchen. "It's just after 2. Are you okay?" Even through the darkness, I could see the concern etched into my wife's beautiful features. Her eyes were wide and telling as her lips repeated her plea for answers. "Are you okay?" It took a second to collect myself, my confusion crippling in a heavy sort of way. "I am," I began, my mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. "I think I was just sleepwalking," I added. My words sounded more of a question than a statement. My wife looked me over once before the concern drifted from her face. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, extending her arm out to me. "Let's get you back to bed." I weakly offered my arm and allowed her to guide me back upstairs to our room, where I quickly fell back asleep. Up until this point, I had never sleepwalked in my entire life. I talked in my sleep, sure, but never sleepwalking. That was news to me, and it was a disturbing sensation to say the least. It followed me into the next day and persisted throughout. Somehow it felt more than just sleepwalking. Somehow I just knew. The day passed like a dream, and before I knew it, night had fallen once more. "Do you want to talk about it?" my wife asked, lying next to me on the bed. I shook my head. Even though the room was silent, I still felt as if I could hear the scratching. "No, I'm fine," I lied, as I pulled the covers over and turned over. "Okay, I love you, baby," she whispered. "I love you too." It's dark, and I'm standing in our kitchen. I inhaled deeply and took a second to steady myself, my limbs shaking as the realization of what happened crept slowly through my body. This time my wife wasn't there to comfort me. This time, every single drawer had been removed from their cabinets and were now perched precariously on the various surfaces above. What is happening? Confused and distressed, I began to quietly slip each drawer back into the cabinet which housed them, and then slunk carefully back upstairs to bed. Just before my fragile mind drifted back into the sleep of abyss, I felt as if I could hear it again, a scratching, tearing and cutting somewhere deep within the walls. I did not tell my wife of this second transgression. I thought she would only worry. Ironically, this seemed to make matters worse as she quickly picked up on my silence throughout the day as we continued unpacking the rest of my belongings. "What's wrong?" she asked, sitting next to me on the sofa. I struggled to comprehend an answer. After all, what was wrong? I couldn't even fathom a response, let alone formulate the words required to convey the feeling which lingered deep inside me. My lips moved, and I found myself saying the first thing which came into my mind. "I think we should move the bed." She nodded slightly at my words. She knew what I meant by them, even though I never actually had to say it. "Okay, we can move it first thing tomorrow. One more night, okay? Because I'm shattered." One more night. I could make it one more night. The hours passed, and again the sky turned black as we drifted peacefully off to sleep. "Baby, stop, please, you're scaring me." Suddenly I was aware that I was not in bed. I was standing, but was still in the room. A few seconds later, I realized I was standing upright on the bed facing the wall. I looked down at my wife, the horror clear even through the darkness. "What?" was the only word which seemed to come. She was shaking, obviously. After a few moments of silence, she collected herself and brought her arms up to me. "Come on, come here." Confused, I once again allowed myself into her arms as she guided me back into the mattress. Her hand moved up to my hair as she began to run her fingers lovingly through it. "Shh, it's okay. Go back to sleep." My mind quickly sank back into nothingness. In the morning, she explained exactly what happened. She had awoken suddenly in the night when she realized that I wasn't laying next to her. After rolling over, she was shocked to find me standing upright on the bed, silently and still staring at the wall with my back to her. She tried to call out to me before I finally answered. Understandably, this shook her up quite a bit. I went on to divulge the second instance of my sleepwalking, and soon after we moved the bed from the corner of the room. To this day, we've never slept in that corner again. It's been 6 years since then, and we still avoid going anywhere near that corner. My sleepwalking has not happened since we moved the bed, and thankfully, I've never heard the scratching again either. To be honest, I try not to think about those 3 nights so long ago. It's hard to because I never really got any closure. If I had seen a ghost, if I could have at least pointed a finger, "Yep, ghouls." If I maybe had seen a rat or a mouse, I could have explained away the scratching. But there was nothing. It all just stopped just as suddenly as it had begun. The second we vacated that particular corner of the room. And I guess looking back on it now, that's the most horrifying part of it all. I will never know why these things happened. And even more hauntingly, I will never be able to predict if they will ever happen again. And that is the thought which lingers most during the dark nights, repeating with my mind as I tap away at my keyboard and hoping to God that I never hear that awful scratching ever again. The first story I'm going to tell you is a story relayed to me by my late father, and it was something that happened to him and my eldest half-sister when she was a teenager. Allow me to give you some background. My half-sister Giselle had always been able to see ghosts since she was a child, and being able to do so has made her feel like she was cursed, especially since the entity she sees always appears solid and showed up unexpectedly during the most unexpected of times. My oldest sister Isabel seems to share that curse, since she experiences the same thing. I, however, can only see shadows from the corner of my eye, as well as feel others' presences when I'm alone, and yet I look, but no one's there. I just pray that I never encounter a ghost up front like my older sisters have. At the time of this event, Giselle was 14 years old, and accompanying my father one weekend as she was scouting for a new house to move into, since Giselle's mother was pregnant with her 6th child, and things were getting cramped in their current residence. My father noticed that Giselle had been clinging to his arm very tightly ever since they entered the front gate, and had been glancing around with clear unease. According to my father, the house was a 2-story house, comfy looking and quite spacious, only with a few repairs needed in a room or two, and the price the owner was giving him was much lower than he had expected it to be. However, my father couldn't shake off the feeling he had as soon as my sister entered the house. The atmosphere felt heavy and so wrong. Add to the fact that Giselle had seemed reluctant to enter the house and was no longer looking around, but constantly turned to look over her shoulder. As the tour of the house progressed, my father saw that Giselle's unease had melted into complete and utter terror, her face extremely pale, that he thought at one point she was going to faint, and she practically had his arm in a death grip. Giselle, however, refused to say a word when he asked what was wrong, just shaking her head and practically gluing herself to his side as she trembled. My father knew just by the terrified look on Giselle's face that buying that house would be a mistake. Once the tour was over, my father informed the owner that they wouldn't be buying the house, as tempting as the low price was, but thanked him for his time. When my father and Giselle were in the car, he noticed how her eyes were fixed on one of the windows on the 2nd floor, and because he knew that she could see something he couldn't, he asked her what was wrong. My sister tore her dark eyes away from whatever she had been looking at, before turning to him still terrified. "Dad?" Her normally high-pitched voice was barely a whisper. "There was a woman in black following us around while we were going through the house. She was floating, and she had a black veil over her head, but I could see her face. It was white, so white, and her eyes, they were pure black, but at the same time, blazing with hatred. And she had a snarl on her face and followed us at a distance, but stopped at the foyer after you and I stepped out the door. She was watching us from one of the windows on the 2nd floor just now. She was just filled with hate." My father had started driving as Giselle spoke, and he felt a chill run down his spine once she finished. They didn't bother looking at any other houses that day, despite my father having listed 4 more to look at, because he told me that what Giselle had told him rattled him more than he wanted to admit, and he felt quite drained. I don't even want to think about what would have happened if they'd have brought that house. The next story was told to me by my parents and takes place in a building that my parents and I were residing in shortly after I was born. It seems the building was quite haunted, and they had only learnt about it after moving in. All the people residing there had their own stories to tell. It was just before lunch on the day my parents brought me back from the hospital, and I was asleep in my mother's arms. Just as soon as my parents stepped in their flat and were about to insert the key into the lock, they were startled when something collided with the door, barely missing my father's head. The noise jolted me from my sleep and I began to wail. They whipped their head towards the winding staircase that led to the upper floors, and my father ran to the foot of the stairs to see who had thrown the dirt, but there was no one about, and they would have heard someone running on the tiled floor, or any of the doors slamming, but it was completely silent since it was a weekday and the neighbors were at work. After ushering my mother inside, my father took a look at what had nearly struck him, and saw it was a ball of dirt, compacted perfectly into shapes, as if someone had taken the time to form it and harden it with their hand before hurling it in his direction. My father took a gardening trowel and scooped it up, before showing it to my mother, who was trying to comfort me since I was still crying up a storm. When the neighbors arrived from work several hours later, they saw my father standing at the foot of the stairs looking up. They asked what was wrong, and he proceeded to tell them the events of the day and showed them the ball of dirt that had caused the fuss. Little things would happen as the months went by. Some that were harmless, others not so. Sometimes when my father was at work and my mother was carrying me as she moved about the house, she noticed how I kept shifting in her arms and laughing, as if there was someone playing peekaboo with me, even though she knew that we were the only ones there. Other times she would hear me squealing with delight in my crib when she had her back to me, and when she turned around, I would be reaching into the air as if trying to grab something. One night, while both my parents were laying in bed, gazing at me as I slept between them, they heard the unmistakable sound of someone walking into the bedroom and stopped outside the door. They heard the unmistakable sound of the doorknob rattling, as if someone was trying to get in but the door was locked. The rattling stopped, only to be followed by a light knocking. My father turned on the bedroom light, demanding to know who it was, but the knocking stopped and there was only silence. Nothing else happened that night. However, neither of my parents got any sleep. The next morning they checked all the doors and windows, and everything was locked. We moved out of that place that same weekend. I'm a native of Long Island, New York, which, as you may know, has been settled for a long time and has a lot of little old towns, especially on the eastern end of the island. We even have some Revolutionary War history. At the time of this story, I was seeing a guy from the local area, and one night he took me to a bar called the Checkmate Inn in Setterket, because some friends of his worked there, and it was supposed to be this cool old local spot with a few interesting stories. It used to be a private home and sits on a barely lit single-lane road winding through rows of tall trees. It actually still looks like an old house, and even has a cellar where they store the alcohol. Its second story has been converted into some apartments above the bar area, and staff sometimes rent them out. Across the street from the Checkmate is the Thompson House, an old wooden structure built in 1709, belonging to a doctor during the Revolutionary War, and is now a museum of colonial medicine. We got there before the big rush of customers showed up, and we were able to talk with one of his buddies who tended the bar that evening. Somehow the subject of ghost stories came up. My date's buddy told me that he'd rented one of the upstairs apartments and had some weird experiences up there. There had been a few nights when he'd awoken at 3 a.m. to see a shadow standing on the opposite side of the bedroom, or being alone in the apartment at night and hearing footsteps passing through the other rooms, having glass beer bottles suddenly slide off the kitchen table and crash to the floor, or witnessing his bedroom curtains waving wildly as if blown by a strong wind, only to find that the windows were closed and locked. One night he woke up in the darkness to see an old man leaning over his bed, looking furiously angry. Thinking someone had broken in, he yelled at the man and sat up, but in that moment the man vanished. His brother had worked at the bar and rented one of the apartments before him as well, and reportedly saw not only the shadowy figure of an old man, but also what appeared to be a young woman in a pale dress in his bedroom at night. He never got a good look at her face though. Apparently the brother's girlfriend had stayed there with him overnight a few times, and had seen the woman as well. The bartender had worked at the Checkmate for about a year at that time, and while he no longer rented the apartment there, he continued to have strange things happen to him while on the job. The most active part of the building was the old cellar. He said it's very dark and cool down there, and several times he'd gone down to grab another keg of beer or bottles of liquor, and had bottles flung at him when he was the only one down there. He'd also been pushed on the stairs while carrying bottles once. His co-workers also told stories of having an uneasy feeling in the cellar, and having kegs rolled across the room suddenly, or having bottles thrown at them. When they went to confront whoever was on shift with them at the time, they were always in another part of the building and denied playing jokes. He wasn't sure about the history of the house or whether anyone had passed away there, though. The home is from the mid-1800s, so I'm not sure if it had many owners through the years. While I love ghost stories, and so did my date, we didn't find them so much scary as thought-provoking and entertaining. We enjoyed the rest of our night and went to leave at about 2:30 in the morning. Most of the patrons had left at that point, with just 2 or 3 stragglers hanging out on the back deck. We each had driven ourselves to the bar, and I had parked on the side of the road in front of the old Thompson house. We stood in front of the house talking for several minutes, and then shared a long kiss. Suddenly, both of us were startled by a very loud thump right next to us. We pulled apart, and I started looking around for what could have made the noise. A few feet away, rolling towards the road, was a huge rock, almost the size of a cantaloupe. I was trying to be brave and picked it up. It must have weighed 5 or 6 pounds. I was pissed, thinking one of his friends at the bar had thrown it at us as an incredibly mean and unfunny joke. No one was around, and as we had been standing around for a while, we would have seen anybody crossing the road. The checkmate is set about 100 yards from the road, and then off to the side is the patio. If someone had thrown it from across the street, they'd have to have been a shot-put champ to hurl a 6-pound rock almost 200 yards. And even then, why was the rock bouncing quickly towards the road? None of the few remaining bar patrons had moved from their seats, and no one was up or moving around on the other side of the road. It looked as if it had been thrown from the direction of the dark woods surrounding the Thompson house. I walked around the property expecting to find someone hiding in the bushes, but I didn't see or hear anything. Neither of us had seen or heard anyone walking around. It was a still night on a quiet road, and unable to come up with an explanation, we were both pretty freaked out and decided that was our cue to leave. Something around there was clearly not happy with PDA. I'm no longer seeing the guy, as I haven't gone back there since, but one day when the COVID lockdown is over, I'd like to go back and see if any of the current bar staff have any new stories to tell. Besides, it's a fun local bar and a good spot for a low-key night out. Next story. I now live in Northern Virginia, and as it so happens, the Gettysburg battlefield is only about an hour-and-a-half drive away from where I currently reside. If you've ever heard the stories, the battlegrounds and the surrounding neighborhoods are supposed to be extremely haunted. They have some fantastic ghost tours there, and the town and battlefields have their own sort of aura about them. Even without hearing the stories, I went on a ghost tour one night with a friend of mine. At one point in the tour, we arrived at a creek on the edge of town. The story as told by our guide was that on the second day of the battle, a group of wounded Union soldiers had taken refuge in the creek bed, which was dry in the middle of summer. Many of them were badly injured and unable to move. Unfortunately, the summer storm came through and it began to rain heavily, flooding the creek bedding and drowning all of the wounded men. Not one of them survived, according to the tale. Well, it was nighttime when I stood there, and pitch black. I hung back as the tour group moved on to their next stop and looked around. There's a lot of long grasses and cattails growing along the creek now, and I decided just for the fun of it to take some pictures of them in the dark. I had flash on, and of course I made sure that there was no one in front of me or around me at the time. I really didn't expect anything, but figured why not. The next day, as I got home, I was looking through my tour photos, and in one of the pictures I had taken of the creek, you can see the reeds and cattails very clearly, lit up by the flash. Floating above them, in the upper hand corner of the picture, dim but still very visible, was a face. It was the side view of a man's face, and you could easily make out a blue cap from the front of a blue-collared coat and yellow buttons. The forehead, eyes, nose, and parts of the chin as well as what would appear to be dark hair under the cap, were very distinct. Remember again that this face is floating above the tall plants in the creek, and while not transparent, it does seem to be lit up by the flash. The two other photos I took of the same spot within seconds of each other had nothing on it. The blue military-looking coat and cap made me wonder if this could have been the apparition of a Union soldier, hanging around the spot where he'd tragically drowned. I showed the photo to a few people without pointing anything out to them, and every one of them immediately noticed the face. The third story here was told to me by a friend of mine who hails from Michigan. She was in a sorority during her undergrad years, and one of the sorority chapter houses had a ghostly legend attached to it. Apparently, a former sister had graduated and returned to the university years later as a professor. I'm not sure of the details, but her life was brutally ended in her home one night, and I don't think the killer was ever caught. Since then, the sorority house, where she had spent so much of her time of her life in, has been the site of disembodied footsteps, doors opening and closing, lamps turning on and off by themselves, and generally only when one of the sisters was alone in the house at night. She claims that many of the sisters she knew had experiences like this. One day, a visitor of one of the sorority's national councils came for a visit and stayed at the house. Not being from the local area, she decided to do some sightseeing in a nearby city and brought her GPS with her. This was several years ago, before everyone had a GPS on their phones. She had kept the GPS in her room at the sorority house that day and used it to navigate the city. On her way in, she experienced no problems and found her destination without difficulty. On her way home later that night, she plugged in the address to the house and soon noticed that her return route bore no resemblance to the one she'd taken earlier in the day. After many unfamiliar twists and turns, the GPS told her that she had arrived at her destination. The problem was she had not arrived at the sorority house, but a cemetery. After messing around with the device and re-entering the address, she finally found her way back to the sorority house and explained to one of the hosts what had transpired. Upon revealing the name of the cemetery, she was informed that it just so happened to be the one that the murdered former sister was buried in. This story happened to me all throughout my life. In any case, let's jump to the first experience. My mum had just gotten me into Michael Jackson back in 2003, when she got me his #1 hit records. I had a 6 CD stereo with a remote in my room, and I fell asleep listening to the music. One night I was listening and Thriller was on. This had the Vincent Price ending, and at the end of the song, a door squeaks when it's closing. My closet was almost an entire wall, and it was 2 side doors. Well, the song ended, and I saw one of my closet doors push out and close, making a similar song. I ran downstairs and told my mum and her ex. They assured me it was my mind just playing tricks on me. They walked up to my room with me, checked the closet to put me back in bed. A few months later, I was laying in bed trying to get to sleep. I used to keep my bedroom door open for the light in the bathroom. But my mum and her ex got me a lava lamp since they were trying to lower the light bill. It's around midnight, a school night. My lava lamp is on. My stereo is playing a local radio station at a low volume, and I'm staring at my door as I try to drift off to sleep. I saw a figure walk through my door. She had a pink aura. It wasn't bright, but I knew it was a lady, and she was a bit on the heftier side, and I could tell from her facial features that she was middle-aged and dark-skinned. She was walking towards me, slowly, and I was frozen in fear, so I put the blankets over my head and kept them there for the rest of the night. I fell asleep at one point, waking up to my alarm clock. I never told my mum or boyfriend about this experience, and I was very reluctant to tell my mum's boyfriend because he always comes off as one to chalk things up to being my imagination. My second experience was quite a while later. I was 18. I was in my room watching Step Brothers when I hear a slight knock. I had no idea if it was coming from the movie or not, and I thought it could have been my sister or mum wanting to come in and talk to me. I rewinded the movie and heard no knock, so I opened my door and saw the ghost again. She was at the bottom of the steps and was turning the corner to go downstairs. I wasn't scared, for at this point, I had been really into the paranormal and she meant no harm. Or so I thought. A few months after this, my friend came over, and we were in my room talking about the paranormal, when the topic of ghosts comes up. I tell her my experiences and start stupidly mocking the ghost I had seen twice. I say she won't come out and show herself and that she's too scared to do so. My friend leaves and I go to bed at some point, and wake up the next day with scratches that start from my right ankle around my leg twice and up to my inner thigh. My leg was really sore. The line was perfectly intact and there's no way I could have done it in my sleep. I pondered on what it could have been, and I can vividly remember looking around my room and saying, "I'm sorry for mocking you. I won't do it again." Those three experiences are pretty far apart, but between them I've had some unexplained stuff happen. Our house phone illuminates at night, and at one point the upstairs bathroom toilet didn't flush. Walking down the steps and into the kitchen, then downstairs to use the bathroom, I can look to see the time on the phone as I'm walking into the bathroom. I can remember it was between 3:30 and 3:45. I was in the bathroom for a while, and when I walk out I go check the time on the phone. But it wasn't on the charger. It was about 7 feet away on the table. I could chalk it up to my mum or her ex because they slept in the living room, but they rarely ever woke up in the middle of the night. And even so, why grab the phone so late? The TV was off and I'd hear them if they were up. I've heard steps in the downstairs room, the tables and chairs not being in the same place just seconds after seeing them in another spot. I even had my first and only episode of sleep paralysis, which was nothing too horrifying, just unable to move, breathe, and open my eyes for 15 seconds. Nothing scary. We had 2 dogs, and one stayed inside and one stayed outside and in the garage. And there are times when the inside one would stop what he was doing and just stare at a wall or corner. Sometimes he'd bark, and other times he'd give off a low growl. My mum worked at a college for a long time, and there was a foreign exchange student from the UK. We became very close. We'd often stay together, and my mum's ex and the student and I were watching The Exorcist and got to talking about stuff. By this time I didn't care what my mum's ex thought of my experiences, and I told them the things that had happened. As I'm explaining, I don't go into the details of the ghost outside and how she had a pink aura, and my mum's ex kept asking if it was a dark lady on the heavier side. At one point I told him it was, and finished my story. When I was done I told him that he probably didn't believe me, and he said he did. What he said next though sent chills down my spine. He said he was good friends with the former house owner. He got it way before we moved in, and the former house owner died in the living room after having a heart attack. He purchased the house soon after her untimely death, and told me her name was Ernestine, and she had pink curtains, pink rug, and her favorite color was pink. I never doubted or put my experiences off to my imagination, because I've had some odd things happen at my grandma's house before we moved in with my mum's ex. But this sold me that the house was being watched over by her, and she'd taken a liking to me, despite me mocking her that one time. I grew up in a haunted house, and never really liked talking about it. The house had a bit of a messy history as well, but I'm not sure if that really ever played a part. Not the stuff I'm aware of anyway. When I grew up, my brother and I talked about it, and it turns out he'd experienced things as well, though I never went into any details of my own. The part people seem most interested in are the 3 specific things that I encountered frequently. So that's what I'm going to focus on. The first is the boy. There was a young boy of maybe 9, perhaps even a little younger, who stayed in my room. I wasn't even aware of him until I moved from my brother's room to my own. He never spoke and always seemed really scared. He hid in different places in my room, under the bed, in the closet, in corners, even once or twice in the upper corner of the room against the ceiling. Sometimes suggested he may be scared of the other two, but I didn't know if he was even aware of the old woman, who was the only other one that came into my room. I don't know for sure, I guess. I don't know anything for sure. But to be fair, whatever the case, I recall that he had shortish but messy brown hair and wore red, white, and blue striped rugby-style shirt. I believe he was aware of me. He mostly kept to himself, but he would stare at me sometimes, and would open and close my closet and this little armory in my room. But most of the time, if I didn't see him, I wouldn't even know that he was there. The old lady. She was not confined to my room, but I rarely saw her anywhere else. Like I said, she used to wake me up staring at me face to face, almost nose to nose. She had huge eyes. I remember that vividly. Whenever I would see her, she would usually be staring at me. I always had this feeling that when she was in my face at night, she was checking on me to see if I was breathing. I really don't know why I got that feeling. She was mostly not frightening, but she scared me once or twice pretty badly. Once was at night. I was maybe 10 to 11. She woke me up right in my face. The problem was I was already having a pretty bad nightmare. I pretty much only have nightmares and stress dreams, and I screamed. I don't know if that scared her or annoyed her, but she shrieked and sort of scuttled away. That was the worst one. Other times she mainly just creeps me out. She likes to hum these weird sounding songs and basically looks like an old lady. Floral print dress and stockings. The eyes were pretty creepy as well though, I suppose. Next, the bad one. This is the only one I genuinely feared. It never touched or hurt me, except when I would fall or stub a toe while fleeing. Sometimes it felt like a woman, but other times it didn't feel like a specific gender. It liked to chase me, especially up the stairs. When it did that, it was a woman with very stringy and greasy hair, and it either didn't have a jaw or its jaw was unhinged, with something disgusting slobbering from the mouth. Its tongue hung from its mouth almost to the floor, and it was wearing something very bulky. The best I can describe it is that it seemed to be wearing a guile suit. It had fringes and was dark, seemed dirty as well. I'm not even sure if it was clothing or being worn. The strangest part of this one is that I never saw it like I did the others. I just sort of felt it, and always had a vivid mental image. It didn't always look like a woman thing. Sometimes I didn't get an image, only a feeling. She used to scream as I turned the hall corner too, just to jump scare me, it seemed. It was a real a-hole, even though it never touched me. I always got the feeling that it hated me, like if it had the ability to, it would have hurt me. I would talk about it more, but as a grown man, I've got knots in my tummy just thinking about it. I often doubt if I even believe my own experiences. I have been plagued with nightmares for so long, but I never rule out dreams. But it doesn't cover all of it. I'm a very logical person and always play the skeptic when I discuss the paranormal with friends. I think this is part of the reason I don't share this stuff often. Maybe only with 3 other people and never in so much detail. So, believe what you want. I may not even believe in it sometimes, and still want to tell myself that it's all just a dream. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope that you really enjoyed the video. I've been reflecting a lot on the work I do, and I'm just so grateful that so many of you guys like listening to my content nearly every day. It's just a lovely feeling that people appreciate what you do and what you do is actually heard. So thank you, everyone. I really do appreciate it. As I was saying at the start, A Right Struggle is an upcoming writer. His Instagram, is pretty interesting. He posts little horror niblets and literally 2-sentence horror stories almost, sometimes a little bit less, 1 sentence, but they are pretty cool. And he's up and coming, and I really do recommend checking him out. Really fun stuff. But just thank you, everyone. I really do appreciate each and every one of you. I hope you know that. I think I'm going to end the video here. I'll hopefully see you tomorrow with another video. But for now, it's time for me to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.